They called her lame and left her for dead, until the lonely rich rancher found her crawling and... Montana Territory, late winter, 1873. Snow fell in heavy silence. A white curtain stretched over pine and rock. The wind had stilled, but the cold pressed deep into the bones of the land. Under a pale sky, Thatcher Rowe guided his horse through a narrow forest path where the snow reached up past the knees of his gelding. He had come to find a missing bay colt that had slipped the fence that morning. The search had taken him miles from his ranch, past frozen creeks and the faint outlines of game trails. His coat was heavy with frost, beard dusted in ice, and one ear, the right, heard nothing, dead silence that never quite stopped ringing since Shiloh. But now something else drew his attention. A mark in the snow, long, irregular, not hoof or paw. It dragged, human. He dismounted without a word, crouching low to examine it. The trail snaked through the trees, broken by crimson smears like scattered berries against white. He followed. Each step took him deeper into silence, past wind-scarred trunks and hushes of birdless branches. Then, ahead, he saw her. A woman. She crawled, barely, using her elbows. Her long skirts were torn and frozen to her legs. One boot gone, the other soaked through. Her left leg bent awkwardly, trailing behind her like dead weight. Her hair was tangled with snow and blood. Her eyes, those eyes held no fire, no pleading, only the blank hollowness of someone left too long in the cold. When she saw him, she flinched, but could not flee. Her lips moved, cracked and colorless. "They called me lame," she rasped, "and left me." She dropped her head to the snow, breath shallow. Thatcher knelt beside her, his voice low but firm. "Not today." He shrugged off his coat, wrapping it around her shaking frame. Her body was burning cold, skin waxen beneath the frostbite. He eased her into his arms, lifting her gently but with purpose. Her leg was bad, maybe worse, but she was breathing. He whistled once. His horse stepped forward, reins slack. With effort, he got her onto the saddle, then climbed up behind, anchoring her against his chest. She was so light, too light. The wind stirred again. Halfway through the forest, a gray shape slunk between trees. A coyote, then another, hungry, quiet. He tightened his grip on the reins, one arm still holding her upright. "You just hold on," he said softly. "Ain't your time." She didn't answer. Her head rested under his chin, breath uneven. The ranch lay still ahead, miles of snow and silence. But he rode steady, not fast. Rushing would break them both. The snowfall thickened as they reached the ridge. Below, his cabin stood alone, a dark shape against the white. Smoke from the chimney curled lazily, as if surprised by company. The porch was drifted over, but the barn door stood open, a lantern swaying within. By the time they reached it, his legs were numb. He dismounted stiffly, catching her before she slipped from the saddle. She stirred faintly. He spoke again, more to keep her tethered to this side of life than anything. "You got a name?" She didn't speak, didn't need to. He carried her up the porch steps. The wood creaked under their combined weight. The sky had turned gray as steel, and snow began falling harder, not in flurries now, but in a quiet, relentless curtain. He opened the door, warmth brushing against his frozen face, then kicked it shut behind him. Together, they disappeared into the light, two shadows against the storm, as snow swallowed their footprints. Inside the cabin, the fire was already burning low, glowing dim and orange against the stone hearth. Thatcher laid her gently onto the cot he'd set near the flames, careful not to jostle her injured leg. He had no help here, not for years. He did not need any, until now. He stoked the fire with one hand, pulled his saddlebag over, and began the work. He had done this before, many times, on muddy battlefields, under cannon fire, with men screaming or worse, silent. Back then, he was Lieutenant Thatcher Rowe, Confederate artillery, before the shells deafened one ear and ended the noise forever. What lingered now was quieter. Ghosts. and memories. He cut away the frozen cloth from her leg, saw where the skin had torn and bruised. The wound was deep, red and angry under layers of dried blood and frostbite. "This'll sting," he muttered, though she was beyond hearing. He cleaned the wound with warm water, poured from the kettle he always kept filled. Then came the salve, herbs ground by hand, boiled with fat and pine resin. Thick, pungent, and meant to draw out rot. He worked with slow, practiced hands. Then he wrapped the leg in clean cloth, tied snug. She whimpered once, but didn't wake. Outside, the wind picked up. He rose, grabbing his rifle, and stepped out onto the porch. Snow hit his face like sharp needles. He squinted into the gray, saw movement, something quick, low to the ground. A lean shape in the dark. Coyote. Another rustled the brush nearby. He cursed under breath, then moved fast. In 10 minutes, one of them lay dead behind the barn, shot clean through the eye. He skinned it on the chopping block, working quickly, fingers stiff with cold. The meat he'd cook, the pelt, he needed more. Back inside, he placed the fresh hide over the woman's legs, then draped a heavy fur over her chest and arms. Her breathing was still uneven, but stronger now, visible in the firelight. The kettle whistled. He poured a mug of broth and sat in the chair opposite the fire, rifle resting by his boot. The wind moaned outside like a voice too tired to speak. Her lips moved in sleep, murmuring. He leaned closer. "No, not him, not my baby." She whimpered again, twisting weakly. He didn't speak, just sat there, jaw clenched, watching her relive whatever fire she had crawled from. Morning passed slowly. Snow slid down the roof in heavy sheets. The fire popped, and the smell of broth and smoke filled the room. Then, movement. Her fingers twitched. A low groan escaped her throat. He set the mug down, moved to kneel beside her. Her eyes fluttered, then opened fully. At first confusion, then fear. She stared at him, breath shallow. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe now." Her voice cracked. "Where am I?" "My ranch. You passed out on the North Ridge. I brought you back." She tried to sit up but gasped in pain. "Easy." She looked down at the hide over her, the blankets, the bandaged leg, then up at him. Her lips trembled. You didn't leave me." "No," he said, "I didn't." She blinked fast, then closed her eyes, breathing in deeply through her nose. Her hands clutched the blanket tighter. He stood slowly, turned toward the fire. Behind him, her voice came again, this time steadier. "What's your name?" "Thatcher Rowe." She hesitated, then said, Amelia Boone." The name hung in the warmth for a moment. A crackle of snow slid down the window pane. Outside, the storm eased. She reached out, her hand weak, searching for something. He moved to her side again. Her fingers brushed his coat sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered. For the first time since he'd found her, Thatcher allowed himself to exhale. "You're welcome." They said nothing more. Snow drifted beyond the windows. Inside, the fire burned steady, and for a moment, nothing was broken. Not the silence, not the two of them. Just warmth and survival. The room was quiet but not silent. The fire in the hearth crackled gently, casting shifting light across the wooden walls. Outside, a soft layer of snow reflected pale light through the small window, giving the room a silver hue. The warmth clung to the air, but so did a kind of stillness, fragile, temporary. Amelia's eyes blinked open. For a moment, she didn't move, her breath caught. Then her hand shot out, clutching the edge of the blanket, then the bed frame. "Where is he?" she gasped, voice brittle. "Where's the man who left me?" Her heart pounded. She tried to sit up too fast. Pain exploded from her leg, and she bit down a scream. Her hands trembled. Her eyes darted across the room, wide with fear. The door creaked open. Thatcher stepped inside, carrying a basin of warm water and a small tin of salve. His face was calm, but his eyes were watchful. "You're not his anymore," he said, voice low and firm. "You're safe." Amelia stared at him. For a second, she didn't know whether to believe him. Then, as if her body remembered what her mind hadn't yet caught up to, she slumped back onto the pillows, shoulders sagging. She closed her eyes. Her breath slowed, but her jaw remained tight. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said, placing the basin on the table. "But your fever's broken. That's something." She didn't answer. Thatcher knelt beside the bed, checking the bandages. When she flinched, he paused. "You want water?" he asked. She nodded faintly. He held the cup to her lips. She drank in small sips, then leaned back, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, her voice came, cracked but steady. "The train was supposed to take us west. Me, my husband, and our boy. 2 years old. We were leaving the mess back east, starting over." She looked past Thatcher, eyes unfocused. It happened outside Cheyenne. The train was full of families, folks trying to make a new life. Then, they came. Thatcher listened, silent. 3 of them, bandanas over their faces. One had a scar like a crack down his cheek. They fired into the air, yelling. "My husband!" Her voice hitched. He ran, didn't look back, just ran. She pressed her hand to her chest. Her voice dropped. "I was holding Thomas, our son. He was crying. Then, one of them shoved me. My grip slipped. Thomas fell." Thatcher's throat tightened, but he said nothing. "I heard the gun. I thought, maybe it missed. But when I looked down," her voice broke completely. She turned her face away, covering it with one hand. Her shoulders shook. "I wanted to die with him, but the train didn't let me." The fire popped softly. When she looked back, tears streaked her cheeks. She looked small, not because of her body, but because of the weight she carried. Thatcher didn't try to stop the silence that followed. When he finally spoke, it was gentle, certain. "Then you lived for 2. Amelia's lip trembled. She looked at him as if unsure what to make of the words. He didn't explain them. Instead, he reached for the bandage on her leg. "I need to wrap this again." She didn't resist. As he unwound the old cloth, she winced, but didn't pull away. Thatcher worked quietly. His hands were strong but careful. Every move was precise, like he'd done it 100 times, and he had, just not here, not like this. He cleaned the wound again, applied more salve, and rewrapped the leg with clean cloth, tight enough to hold but not choke. When he finished, he placed his hand lightly on her shoulder. Not to comfort, not to pity, just to say, "I'm here." Amelia looked at the hand, then up at him. A breath passed between them. One moment, one unspoken acknowledgement. Then she laid back against the pillow, eyes half closed, not asleep, but resting. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle, slow, like a world trying to start over. Inside, the fire burned steady. And for the first time in a long time, Amelia Boone wasn't alone. The wind tore across the open stretch of snow-covered land, whistling through the branches like the cry of something ancient. Thatcher Rowe swung his axe into the log, the crack echoing sharp against the silence. A plume of white lifted from the chopped wood. Then he saw the rider. A dark silhouette against the pale horizon, approaching with purpose. The man sat tall in the saddle, dressed in fine wool and polished boots not made for ranch roads. His hat was clean, his gloves expensive. Everything about him looked Eastern, civilized in the way that made men dangerous out here. Thatcher straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his glove, and watched as the stranger slowed near the edge of the ranch. When the rider dismounted, he walked with an air of confidence, a briefcase tucked under one arm. His smile was thin, his eyes sharp. "Afternoon," the man said. "Name's Garrett Duval." The name sat in the air like a dropped stone. "I believe you have someone of mine inside." Thatcher's fingers curled slowly around the axe handle. "That right?" Garrett nodded. "Amelia Boone, formerly Duval. She's my wife, by law still is." Thatcher didn't flinch. Law's funny about things, especially when a man runs off and leaves his family behind. Garrett's smile never wavered. "We had complications. I'm here to make things right. Take her back east. Her place is not here." Crawling around a ranch. Thatcher stepped forward once, eyes dark as flint. "She ain't crawlin' anymore." For a beat, silence. Then Garrett reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, official-looking, with a red wax seal. He handed it over. "Court order. You can check its authenticity if you like. I'll return with my lawyer in 3 days." He turned and mounted his horse in one smooth motion. As he rode off, Thatcher stood unmoving, the paper crumpled slightly in his grip. Inside, Amelia stood at the window, lips parted in silent dread. Her face had gone pale, her hands trembled at her sides. "I saw him," she whispered, when Thatcher stepped through the door. "He really came." "He did," Thatcher said, "but he's not staying." Amelia shook her head slowly. "He won't stop, not when he thinks I still belong to him." "You don't." She looked up at him, eyes wide and frightened, not of Garrett, but of losing everything she'd just started to rebuild. "I'll handle it," Thatcher said simply. That night, a hush fell heavy over the land. The wind had died, but something more dangerous moved with the darkness. Thatcher didn't sleep. He kept the lamp low, rifle by the door. Around midnight, the horses screamed. He was out the door in seconds, boots crunching snow, breath steaming in the cold. A flicker of movement near the barn. Then firelight. Garrett, crouched with a torch, ready to strike the hay. Thatcher raised the rifle and fired a shot into the air. Garrett froze, turned and ran, but Thatcher was faster. They collided in the snow, fists flying. Garrett swung wildly. Thatcher ducked, then landed a brutal punch to his gut, followed by a left hook that knocked him flat into the ice. Garrett gasped, coughing into the cold. Thatcher stood over him, chest heaving. "You don't get to call her yours," he growled. "Not anymore." By sunrise, Garrett was trussed like a calf and hauled behind Thatcher's wagon to the nearby fort. The so-called court order was fake. The soldiers took him in without question. That night, back at the ranch, Amelia sat by the fire, silent for a long time. Then she turned to Thatcher and said, "I thought I was a burden, something people carried until they couldn't anymore." Thatcher looked at her, his voice quiet. "You're not a burden." Amelia's voice trembled. "You made me feel chosen." Outside, the wind had calmed. The snow, finally, began to melt. The snow had started to pull back from the fields, revealing patches of frostbitten earth beneath the weak spring sun. A week had passed since Garrett had been taken away, and the ranch no longer felt like a place of hiding. It felt like something else, something still fragile, but real. Amelia Boone stepped carefully along the porch, her wooden crutch thudding lightly with each movement. Her other hand clutched Thatcher's arm as he walked beside her, slow and steady. "You're not rushing me," she said, almost surprised. Thatcher gave a half smile. "Never met a horse that liked to be broken quick. People no different." They stopped at the fence line, where a few young colts grazed lazily. Thatcher gestured toward one of them, a sandy-colored filly with bright eyes. "Watch this," he said. He didn't raise his voice or snap his fingers. He just stepped close, letting the animal sniff his palm. Then he brushed his hand gently along her neck and murmured something low. The filly blinked and followed him with a calmness that looked like trust. Amelia stared. "You didn't force her." Thatcher shook his head. "You don't break a spirit. You show it. It's safe." Later that week, Junie showed up again. The little girl of Blackfeet blood had wandered in months ago with curious eyes and stubborn silence. Now she tugged Amelia's hand, holding up a slate. "Teacher," she said simply. That word caught in Amelia's chest. She looked to Thatcher. He nodded. "She's been waiting on you." Within days, more children came, quiet ones, wild ones. Amelia gathered them near the cabin and taught them letters, shapes, and songs. She sat beneath a tree with her crutch beside her, reading from a book with cracked leather binding. But one morning, something shifted. It was clear and cold. the sky a blinding blue. Thatcher stood by the fence, arms folded, watching the children recite their words. Amelia turned to the makeshift board nailed to the cabin wall and picked up the chalk. Her hand trembled slightly, as it always did when she stood too long. She wrote, "Hope." Her heart raced. Then, without thinking, she let go of the crutch. She stood. The board swam slightly in front of her, her legs burning, the ache deep in her bones. She wobbled. Gasps came from the children, and then hands caught her from behind, warm and steady. Thatcher's voice was right at her ear. "That's the bravest thing I've seen since the war." She laughed softly, half in disbelief, half in relief. The children clapped. Junie shouted. Teacher stood. That night, on the front porch, they sat in silence. No fire, no sound, but the breeze and the occasional creak of the wood. Thatcher had removed his coat, sleeves rolled to his forearms. Amelia glanced at the deep scar running along the edge of his jaw, the mark of something long healed, but not forgotten. "You've been carrying things too," she said. He nodded slowly. "Shell burst in the ravine. I was the last one out. Left my captain buried under the rocks. I still hear the wind from that night. On the side I can't even hear anymore." Amelia reached out, cupping his face with one hand. "Then let's stop counting the dead," she whispered, "and start counting what we saved." Thatcher didn't move for a long moment. Then he leaned into her touch, not like a man reaching for comfort, but like one finally accepting it. The last of winter fell in soft flurries that morning, quiet and harmless. The Montana plains, still coated in white, no longer felt like a graveyard, but something gentler, like a sheet waiting to be written on. Beneath the surface, the thaw had begun. Streams whispered through the underbrush. The wind, while cold, no longer cut like a blade. It was a farewell breeze. Thatcher Rowe helped Amelia down from the porch, careful with every step. Her crutch bit into the soft earth where snow gave way to mud, but she moved with more ease than even the day before. They made their way to the open field. He said little, guiding her through the thin layer of melting frost. The colts had been moved to pasture. The land was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of ice breaking beneath its own weight. At the edge of the clearing, Thatcher stopped. Amelia looked at him. "This where you come when you don't want to talk?" she asked, smiling. He looked out across the field. "Sometimes." She waited, sensing something unspoken behind the silence. Then he asked, "Would you want to leave this behind, if you could walk without pain, if you could go anywhere?" Amelia didn't answer at once. She looked at her feet, at the boot still braced and bound. Then she lifted her eyes and took in the trees, the fences, the modest ranch behind them, and the man before her. "I'd only want to leave," she said, "if you're not walking beside me." Thatcher inhaled once, slow and quiet. Then he dropped to one knee. Not in the grand, polished way of a suitor, but simple, grounded, steady. His gloved hand reached for hers. "I don't have a ring," he said, "and I don't need you to promise forever." He looked up at her, the silver in his eyes shining under the pale sun. "Just promise to keep standing, and let me stand beside you." Her breath caught. No flourish, no pity, no kneeling prince. Just a man, asking for a place in her life. Amelia's fingers curled into his, then slowly, she let her crutch fall into the snow. Thatcher tensed to catch her, but he didn't need to. Her foot found balance, then the other. She stood, both feet beneath her, back straight, shoulders lifted. She looked down at him, tears rising but not falling. "I promise," she whispered. He stood with her, one hand still on hers, the other resting lightly at her waist. Snowflakes drifted around them, melting as they landed. They didn't kiss. They didn't speak. They just stood, together. And for the first time since the train, since the fire, since the screams and the smoke, Amelia didn't feel like a woman trying to survive. She felt like someone who had come back. Not from the dead, but from silence, from solitude, from all the names others had given her: lame, widow, burden. Now she had only one name, and it was hers to give. The sky above the clearing was a pale, forgiving blue. The snow had receded into patches, leaving the soil damp and the grass struggling to rise. It was neither winter nor spring, only that tender pause between seasons, when the world seemed to hold its breath. Amelia stood at the edge of the field, her hand resting on Thatcher's arm. Her dress was simple, cream linen laced at the sleeves, hem trailing slightly in the mud. Her right leg was still braced, but it did not hinder her now. Her steps were steady, purposeful. "I buried my heart here," she said quietly, "but maybe it is where it can be reborn." Thatcher said nothing. He only nodded, one hand holding hers, the other carrying the wooden box they'd carved together. Inside were a few small keepsakes, tiny shoes, a broken toy horse, and the only photograph she had of her son. Together, they walked to the shallow rise beneath an old sycamore tree, the same tree that had sheltered her from the wind all those years ago, when she had used her bare hands to dig a grave in the frozen earth. No cross had marked it then, just a mother's sorrow and silence. Now they built something more. Thatcher set the box down gently. Amelia arranged white flowers, wild alyssum, collected by Junie, and tied them with simple twine. She placed the photo inside a carved wooden frame, setting it at the center of the altar. "He didn't get a funeral," she murmured. "He didn't get a name spoken after it all. But he gets this, and he gets today." Behind them, footsteps approached softly. Junie, in a pale blue dress, held a small basket of petals. The old minister, back straight despite his years, followed with a leather-bound Bible in hand. He had ridden from the army post that morning, and though the journey was long, he had not hesitated. He owed Thatcher his life, and today he would give back something sacred. The ceremony began without grand speeches. There were no guests, no music, only wind in the trees and the sound of Junie's laughter as she scattered petals in the grass. Amelia stood facing Thatcher, her shoulders lifted high, her eyes holding his without fear. The altar behind her, a reminder of everything she'd lost, and everything she had now chosen. The minister asked for their vows. Thatcher went first, his voice low and sure. "I don't have fancy words, just one truth. You don't need to carry the past alone anymore. Not while I'm standing." Then Amelia, hand in his, answered softly, "You said I lived for two. Today I choose to live for three." Her voice wavered, just once, but her gaze did not. And as those words fell into the still air, they didn't drift away like smoke. They settled, into the earth, into the space where grief had once taken root. The minister nodded, closing his book. "Then by the grace given to me, I pronounce you husband and wife." There was no applause, no music, just a kiss. Slow, reverent, and deep. It was not the beginning of something new. It was the closing of an old wound, a sealing, a vow not only to love, but to rebuild from ruin. Behind them, Junie reached for Amelia's hand and whispered, "He's smiling now, isn't he?" Amelia bent down, kissed the girl's forehead, and said, "Yes, baby," from somewhere warm. Thatcher turned to face the altar one last time. He picked up the frame, ran a thumb across the boy's face, then set it back down and whispered, "We'll keep him with us." As the wind picked up again, fluttering Amelia's veil, the three of them walked away from the grave, not with heavy hearts, but with lighter steps. The place that had once been an end was now a beginning. The spring sun hung gently above the Montana hills, spreading warmth over land that had once known nothing but frost and silence. 1 month had passed since the wedding, and the world outside the Rowe ranch had softened. The soil was dark and wet, full of promise. Grass grew again where the snow had laid its heavy claim. Laughter rang out from the front yard. Children chased each other between the fence posts, little feet pounding against the soft earth, faces flushed with sunlight. A handmade sign hung over the door of the schoolhouse, a modest cabin painted with care. The lettering, carved carefully by Thatcher's hands and painted in Amelia's steady script, read, "The Rowe School, for all who fell and stood again." Inside, Small desks lined the walls. Shelves were filled with hand-sewn readers, worn slates, and bundles of chalk tied with twine. Each afternoon, children from nearby camps and homesteads, native and settler alike, gathered here not just to learn, but to belong. Amelia stood on the steps, her brace replaced now by a cane she barely leaned on. A soft smile curved her lips as she watched Junie hand out books to a younger boy, her voice proud as she explained how to sound out each letter. Thatcher sat at the far edge of the porch, a weathered notebook open on his knee, his pen moving in thoughtful strokes. He paused now and again, looking at Amelia, then back to the page. He wrote, "Dear Will, you once asked if peace ever finds a soldier. I didn't have an answer then, but I do now. It does. She came limping out of the snow and changed everything. Turns out, love is the finest kind of victory. Yours, Thatch." He set the pen down, letting the ink dry in the breeze. His eyes lifted toward Amelia, who was now seated beside a group of children with a picture book open across her lap. Her voice carried softly, clear, confident, as she read aloud. No tremble, no doubt, only warmth. When she finished the story, one of the younger children climbed into her lap, and she didn't hesitate. She held him like a mother would. Like someone who had once lost everything and now chose to give everything back. Thatcher walked over, dropping down beside her with a quiet grunt. He set the letter in his pocket, then reached for her hand. Amelia turned to him, eyes sparkling, and whispered, "They called me lame." He squeezed her fingers gently, the corners of his mouth rising. "But I call you mine." For a long moment, they just sat there. Amelia, Thatcher, and the growing circle of children curled up around them in the soft afternoon light. There was no wind, no ghosts, no heavy past. Only the sound of a turning page, and the deep, steady rhythm of life beginning again. Above the porch, a new sign had been hammered into the old wooden beam. The Rose, built from ashes, standing tall. The words were carved deep, meant to last through storm and season, just like them. If this story moved your heart like it did ours, if you felt the snow melt, if you believed in love rising from ashes, then don't ride off just yet. Hit that hype button to let us know you want more stories like this. And be sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories so you never miss the next tale of grit, grace, and heart on the frontier. Until next time, keep your fire burning and your heart open, because out here, even in the wildest West, love always finds a way.